Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about the causes of the Great Depression and government's early attempts to resolve it. First, though, let's just make sure that we understand what a depression is. A depression is just another word for a panic. Remember how basically every almost 20 years in the 1800s there was a panic, or today we use the term recession, but it's a time in which the economy isn't growing. People aren't spending money. And this in the 1930s is going to be our country's worst depression. So first, let's talk about how this happened. Remember, there were some economic trends we talked about last week that are going to have a bearing on what goes on in the 1930s. Starting with in the 20s, remember, a lot of people are buying things, especially Model T cars, radios, household appliances. And while that's great on the one hand, there's a problem because people are buying these things on credit, meaning that they're buying them now but paying for them later. And so, as you can see here, 60% of cars, 80% of radios are bought on credit. And why is this a problem? How does this help lead to the Great Depression? This chart kind of shows you that. For instance, you could buy a radio on credit in 1 year. This is just a hypothetical example. Maybe you buy a car another year, but then eventually you have to start paying for that radio, right? And then another year you're going to start paying for that car. And then eventually, once you're paying this back, you're probably going to stop spending. Maybe not entirely, but at least a big part of what you were spending before. And that's not good for the economy. We need people spending so that businesses don't shut down and we don't go into a depression. So the fact that so much was being bought on credit, that's what this kind of shows you that, again, even vacuum cleaners, other household appliances, you can see just put $3 down, right? And then you pay the rest monthly. So many different things were being bought on credit. And that's what this graph also shows you. In the 1920s, our debt goes up big time. And again, eventually people are going to have to start paying that back. And that is going to help trigger, not be the sole cause, but help trigger this long depression that we're going to go into. Secondly, remember in the 1920s, we talked about how people's income was generally going up. People were making more money. Businesses were prospering as people were buying more things. And again, that is great on the one hand, but remember, we also talked about this last week, that 40% of the country is not partaking in those increased wages. Farmers are suffering in the 1920s as farm prices were dropping due to diminished demand and greater supply. And so there's an uneven distribution of wealth that's going to help contribute to this decade plus long depression. And this next chart kind of shows you that. If you look at the red, it shows you the top 10% richest people in the country. And as you can see in the 1920s, that percentage is actually going up. So it's almost top 10% of people had almost half of the country's wealth. And then the blue shows you in 1930 here that about 90% of people had to split the other 50% of the wealth. The fact that there was such a big uneven distribution of wealth is going to help contribute to this Great Depression, because if you think about it, wealthy people, if they have so much of the wealth, they can only buy so many Model T cars, so many radios. What are they doing with the rest of their money? They're probably investing it. And investing it, whether it's in places like the stock market or what have you, isn't going to contribute to benefiting the economy. It's just going to make themselves wealthier, but they're not buying things that help for instance, keep us out of the Great Depression. So this is going to be a big problem that, again, looking back, we can see that the 1920s was already helping to spur this on. Also in the 20s, remember we talked about how there was a lot of investment in the stock market. As people started to have extra money, they're investing it in stocks. Remember, stocks are just tiny, tiny pieces of ownership of a company. But keep in mind, even though you can see stock values going up, you don't have that money until you actually sell it, and you got to find a buyer in order to make that difference. And the problem was in 1929, especially, there is going to be a large dip in stock prices. There is a crash, and here you can see it listed as Black Tuesday. There were signs of this happening beforehand in which stock prices tended to fall. Remember, stock prices are not set by the government. It's just based off of supply and demand. If a lot of people are believing in a company, if they want to buy those shares of stock, it's going to drive the shares of stock up. If people all panic, which is what happened, for instance, on Black Tuesday, and they all then start selling their shares of stock, it's going to cause the price of those shares to dip. And that's what happened on Black Tuesday. As you can see, one of the largest single day drops in stock market history. But the stock market continues to actually decline thereafter. Again, keep in mind, not everyone was invested in the stock market. But it's going to have a psychological impact now that people see the stock market take such a sharp decline. And here you can see, whether it's RCA stock going from $94 all the way up to $505 at the lowest point of the stock market crash. In the Great Depression, it's going to get as low as $17. And so this is going to trigger, even though not everyone was invested in the stock market, in general, though, it's going to have a ripple effect that people are spending less money. Again, if there's less purchases being made, that's going to cause businesses to shut down and people lose their jobs. So this is kind of considered to be the last straw, the stock market crash in October of 1929, that's really going to push the United States into this decade-long depression. But again, this didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of economic factors that contribute to kind of this unstable economy. After the stock market crashes, there's a run on banks. Literally, people would run to the bank because they were scared that their money might not be there. And if everyone runs to the bank at the same time, there you can see the outside and the inside of a bank. Banks, remember, are really critical because people put their money into banks. We need banks because then they're going to loan out those people's money so that people can, let's say, buy a Model T car. Buy a radio, invest in a business and, grow a business or buy a house, things like that. We need banks, but everyone got scared. They wanted their money themselves, but the banks had loaned out their money. And as a result, we see an increase in the number of bank failures in which literally banks shut their doors and whatever money you had in there is gone. In just a few months alone in 1933, 20%, 1 out of 5 banks in the United States shut down, losing the life savings of 9 million people. They don't have any insurance, not yet at least, that's going to protect against that. So this is, again, ushering in this Great Depression. Here you can see unemployment. It's typical for unemployment. It's okay for it to be like 5% or less, but as you can see during the years of the Great Depression, it is much, much higher than that. And Ms. Shack's going to talk more about this as it got as high as 25%. And on top of that, you can see that even in more recent years, this graph just looks at from 1948 to present. You can see that there are some times in which unemployment, again, that's the amount of people that are looking for a job that can't find one, that there are times that it got above 5% or even above 10%, although only about 3 times. But if you notice in more recent depressions, or we call them recessions, they lasted a lot shorter time. And so that's another major difference with the Great Depression back then, why it was so bad. How does the government respond to it? President Herbert Hoover is the one that's going to have to deal with this initially. He's president when the stock market crashes, which, like I said, is the last straw and brings on this Great Depression. He was kind of the mindset that this is not the role of the government to help people out in this way. People can choose to help people out, but it's not as though everyone should be, paying their tax dollars to employ people and open up new jobs, things like that. Part of the reason why he felt that is he was orphaned as a kid and kind of pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, going on to graduate from Stanford, became a millionaire, and probably brought some of that philosophy to the White House. There are some people that disagree with him as far as how the government should respond to the Great Depression. There's a group of World War I veterans that march on the nation's capital in 1932 demanding a bonus that was promised to them at some point. They wanted it early, and the government responds by ultimately, even though they set up camp and they're there for many months and it grows to the thousands and tens of thousands of veterans that are there, Herbert Hoover ultimately authorizes the military to go out with tear gas and bayonets and tanks and disperse those veterans. So needless to say, it doesn't make him out to look like the most empathetic person, and he will not be reelected, and that is when FDR then will become president. So hopefully that helps and kind of explain how we got to the Great Depression and just how great or how severe it was. All right, thanks, guys.